Guys, and welcome back to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. When we finished our story yesterday, we had just met the Oompa Loompas, and then we had Veruca Salt, yelling and crying, complaining to her dad that she wanted her own Oompa Loompa, and he was going to get her one. We'll see about that. And then we had Mrs. Gloop yelling at Augustus, Augustus, sweetheart, I don't think you had better do that. Augustus Gloop, as you might have guessed, had quietly sneaked down to the edge of the river, and he was now kneeling on the river bank, scooping hot melted chocolate into his mouth as fast as he could. Remember that Augustus is the big fat kid. So, chapter 17 is where we start today. Augustus Gloop goes up the pipe. When Mr. Wonka turned around and saw what Augustus Gloop was doing, he cried out, "Oh no, please, Augustus, please, I beg you not to do that. My chocolate must be untouched by human hands." "Augustus," called Mrs. Gloop, "didn't you hear what the man said? Come away from the river at once." "This stuff is terrific," said Augustus, not taking the slightest notice of his mother or Mr. Wonka. "Oh boy, I need a bucket to drink it properly." "Augustus," cried Mr. Wonka, hopping up and down and wagging his stick in the air, "you must come away. You are dirtying my chocolate." "Augustus," called Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus," cried Mr. Gloop. But Augustus was deaf to everything except the call of his enormous stomach. He was now lying full length on the ground with his head far down over the river, lapping up the chocolate like a dog. "Augustus," shouted Mrs. Gloop, "you'll be giving that nasty cold of yours to about 1,000,000 people all over the country if you don't stop that." "Be careful, Augustus," shouted Mr. Gloop. "You're leaning over too far." Mr. Gloop was absolutely right, for suddenly there was a shriek, "Ah!" and then a splash, "Psh!" and into the chocolate river went Augustus Gloop. In 1 second he had disappeared under the brown surface. "Save him!" screamed Mrs. Gloop, going white in the face and waving her umbrella all around. "He'll drown! He can't swim a yard! Save him! Save him!" "Good heavens, woman," said Mr. Gloop, "I'm not diving in there. I have my best suit on." Augustus's face came up again to the surface, painted all brown with chocolate. "Help! Help! Help!" he yelled. "Fish me out!" "Don't just stand there!" Mrs. Gloop screamed at Mr. Gloop. "Do something!" "I am doing something," said Mr. Gloop, who was now taking off his jacket and getting ready to dive into the chocolate. Let me show you this picture of Augustus. A little bit he deserved that. But while he was taking off his jacket and getting ready to dive into the chocolate, the wretched boy was being sucked closer and closer towards the mouth of one of the great giant pipes that was dangling down into the river. Then, all at once, the powerful suction took hold of him completely, and he was pulled under the surface and into the mouth of the pipe. The crowd at the riverbank waited breathlessly to see where he would come out. "There he goes!" somebody shouted, pointing upwards. And sure enough, because the pipe was made of glass, Augustus Gloop could be clearly seen shooting up into it, head first, like a torpedo. "Help! Murder! Police!" screamed Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus, come back at once! Where are you going?" "It's a wonder to me," said Mr. Gloop, "how that pipe is big enough for him to go through it." "It isn't big enough," said Charlie Bucket. "Oh dear, look, he's slowing down." "So he is," said Grandpa Joe. "Oh, he's going to stick," said Charlie. "I think he is," said Grandpa Joe. "By golly, he has stuck," said Charlie. "It's his stomach that's done it," said Mr. Gloop. "He's blocked the whole pipe," said Grandpa Joe. "Smash the pipe!" yelled Mrs. Gloop, still waving her umbrella. "Augustus, come out here at once!" The watchers below could see the chocolate swishing around the boy inside the pipe, and they could see it building up behind him in a big solid mass, pushing against the blockage. The blockage was him because he's so fat. The pressure was terrific. Something had to give. Something did give, and that something was Augustus. Whoosh! Up he shot again like a bullet in the barrel of a gun. "He's disappeared!" yelled Mrs. Gloop. "Where does that pipe go to? Quick! Call the fire brigade!" "Keep calm!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Keep calm, my dear lady, keep calm. There is no danger, no danger whatsoever. Augustus has gone on a little journey, that's all. A most interesting little journey, but he'll come out of it just fine. You wait and see." "How can he possibly come out of it fine?" snapped Mrs. Gloop. "He'll be made into marshmallows in 5 seconds." "Impossible," said Mr. Wonka. "Unthinkable, inconceivable, absurd. He could never be made into marshmallows." "And why, may I ask, why not?" shouted Mrs. Gloop. "Because that pipe doesn't go to Marshmallow Room," Mr. Wonka answered. "It doesn't go anywhere near that Marshmallow Room. That pipe, the one Augustus went in, happens to lead directly to the room where I make a most delicious kind of strawberry-flavored, chocolate-coated fudge." "Then he'll be made into strawberry-flavored, chocolate-coated fudge!" screamed Mrs. Gloop. "My poor Augustus! They'll be selling him by the pound all over the country tomorrow morning." "Quite right," said Mr. Gloop. "I know I'm right," said Mrs. Gloop. "It's beyond a joke," said Mr. Gloop. "Mr. Wonka doesn't seem to think so," cried Mrs. Gloop. "Just look at him. He's laughing his head off. How dare you laugh like that when my little boy's just gone in the pipe? You monster!" She shrieked, pointing her umbrella at Mr. Wonka as though she were going to run him through like a sword. "You think it's a joke, don't you? You think that sucking up my boy into your fudge room like that is just one big colossal joke." "He'll be perfectly safe," said Mr. Wonka, giggling slightly. "He'll be chocolate fudge," said Mrs. Gloop. "Never," said Mr. Wonka. "Of course he will." "I wouldn't allow it." "And why not?" shrieked Mrs. Gloop. "Because the taste would be terrible," said Mr. Wonka. "Just imagine it. Augustus flavored chocolate-coated gloop? No one would buy it. Blech." "They most certainly would," said Mr. Gloop indignantly. "I don't want to think about it," said Mrs. Gloop. "Nor do I," said Mr. Wonka. "And I promise you, madam, that your darling boy is perfectly safe." "If he's perfectly safe, then where is he?" snapped Mrs. Gloop. "Lead me to him this instant." Mr. Wonka turned around and clicked his fingers sharp, click, 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 3 times. Immediately, an Oompa Loompa appeared, as if from nowhere, and stood beside him. The Oompa Loompa bowed and smiled, showing beautiful white teeth. His skin was rosy white, his long hair was golden brown, and the top of his head came just above the height of Mr. Wonka's knee. He wore the unusual deerskin slung over his shoulder. "Now listen to me," said Mr. Wonka, looking down at the tiny man. "I want you to take Mr. and Mrs. Gloop to the fudge room and help them find their son. He's just gone into the pipe." The Oompa Loompa took one look at Mrs. Gloop and exploded into peals of laughter. "Oh, do be quiet," said Mr. Wonka. "Control yourself. Pull yourself together. Mrs. Gloop doesn't think it's funny." "You can say that again," said Mrs. Gloop. "Go straight to the fudge room," Mr. Wonka said to the Oompa Loompa. "And when you get there, take a long stick and start poking around inside the big chocolate mixing barrel. I'm almost certain that you'll find him in there. But you better look sharp. You'll have to hurry. If you leave him in the chocolate mixing barrel too long, He's liable to get poured out onto the fudge boiler, and that really would be a disaster, wouldn't it? My fudge would become quite uneatable." Mrs. Gloop let out a shriek of fury. "I'm joking," said Mr. Wonka. "I didn't mean it. Forgive me. I'm so sorry. Goodbye, Mrs. Gloop and Mr. Gloop. Goodbye, goodbye. I'll see you later." As Mr. Gloop and Mrs. Gloop and their tiny escort hurried away, the 5 Oompa Loompas on the far side of the river suddenly began hopping and dancing about and beating wildly on a number of very small drums. "Augustus Gloop," they chanted. "Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop." "Grandpa," cried Charlie, "listen to them, Grandpa. What are they doing?" "Shh," whispered Grandpa Joe. "I think they're going to sing us a song." And they did. "Augustus Gloop," chanted the Oompa Loompas. "Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop, the great big greedy nincompoop. How long could we allow this beast to gorge and guzzle, feed and feast on everything he wanted to do? Great Scott, it simply wouldn't do. However long this pig might live, we're positive he'd never give even the smallest bit of fun or happiness to anyone. So what do we do in cases such as this? We use the gentle touch, and careful we take the brat and turn him into something that will give great pleasure to us all. A doll, for instance, or a ball, or marbles, or a rocking horse. But this revolting boy, of course, was so unutterably vile, so greedy, foul, and infantile, he left a most disgusting taste inside our mouths, and so in haste we chose a thing that, comes what may, would take the nasty taste away. "Come on," we cried, "the time is ripe to send him shooting up the pipe. He has to go, it has to be, and very soon he's going to see, inside the room to which he's gone, some funny things are going on. But don't, dear children, be alarmed. Augustus Gloop will not be harmed, although of course we must admit he will be altered quite a bit. Altered means changed. He will be changed from what he's been when he goes through the fudge machine. Suddenly the wheels go round and round, the cogs begin to grind and pound, 100 knives to slice, slice, slice. We add some sugar, cream, and spice. We boil him for a minute more until we're absolutely sure that all the greed and the gall is boiled away once and for all. Then out he comes, and now, by grace, a miracle has taken place. The boy who only once before was loathed or hated by men from shore to shore, this greedy brute, this louse's ear, is now loved by people everywhere. For who wouldn't hate, for who could hate or bear a grudge against a luscious bit of fudge? "I told you they loved singing," cried Mr. Wonka. "Aren't they delightful? Aren't they charming? But you mustn't believe a word they said. It's nonsense, every bit of it." "Are the Oompa Loompas really joking, Grandpa?" asked Charlie. He wanted to know if they were really going to turn the boy into a big lump of fudge. "Of course they're joking," answered Grandpa Joe. "They must be joking. At least I hope they're joking. Don't you?" And that was the end of chapter 17. And that's where we'll stop today. Bye.